Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we'll be looking at the period from about 1870 to 1890 in American history, what scholars refer to as the Gilded Age. It is the only time in the country's past that's commonly known by a negative moniker. To say that something is gilded means literally that it's covered over in a layer of gold. The shimmering surface, however, hides something dark and sinister underneath. The last decades of the 19th century in the United States witnessed an economic explosion that generated incredibly vast amounts of wealth for some individuals, while the overwhelming majority of Americans were left behind in wrenching poverty. The gap between rich and poor grew dramatically every year. The contrasts were too stark for anyone not to notice, to the point where these extremes of wealth and poverty became the defining characteristic of the age. Between the end of the Civil War and the early 1900s, the United States underwent a second major economic and technological revolution. The causes for this growth were numerous. First, there was the country's abundant natural resources and a growing supply of labor thanks to a constant flow of immigration. This growing population also created an expanding market for manufactured goods, and American business leaders possessed plenty of available capital for investment. Then finally, the federal government itself actively promoted industrial and agricultural development by enacting high tariffs, taxes to protect U.S. businesses from foreign competition. It also granted land to railroad companies to encourage construction of more rail lines. And it used the nation's armed forces, finally, to remove Indians from western lands desired by white farmers and mining companies. These years witnessed a shift in America away from being a predominantly agricultural society to an industrial one. The rapid expansion of things like factory production, mining, and railroad construction in all parts of the country except the South signaled the transition away from a world centered on the small farm and artisan workshop to a mature industrial society. Just a few examples can illustrate the point. By 1880, for the first time, the U.S. Census Bureau found that a majority of Americans were engaged in non-farming jobs. By 1890, 2/3 of laborers worked for wages rather than owning a small farm, business, or craft shop. People were increasingly drawn to factories, lured by the promise of jobs, and a new working class emerged in American cities. Between 1870 and 1920, nearly 11 million Americans moved from farms to cities, and another 25 million immigrants arrived from overseas. If anything made this second industrial revolution possible in the United States, it was the railroad. Here in this first image, we can see exactly where American railroad construction stood around 1880. The red lines demonstrate just how much more developed the northeastern and midwestern sections of the country were in comparison to the South. And we can also see the beginnings of the transcontinental lines that stretched from the east to west coasts. Spurred by private investment and massive grants of land and money from federal, state, and local governments, the number of miles of railroad track in the country tripled between 1860 and 1880, and then tripled again by 1920. Vast new areas were opened up to commercial agriculture, especially in the West, and a truly national market for manufactured goods was created. A consistently growing population moving further and further west formed an ever-expanding market that could sustain the mass production, mass distribution, and mass marketing of goods that were the hallmarks of a modern industrial economy. What many described as a spirit of innovation led to a remarkable series of technological inventions that spurred rapid communication and economic growth in the period, many of which were created by the so-called wizard of Menlo Park, New Jersey, who we see in the image here, Thomas Edison. The opening of what became known as the Atlantic Cable in 1866, which we can get an idea of from this illustration, made it possible to send electronic telegraph messages instantaneously between the United States and Europe. During the 1870s and 1880s, things like the telephone, typewriter, and handheld camera came into use for the very first time. Over the course of his life, Edison helped to establish entirely new industries that completely transformed Americans' private lives, their forms of public entertainment, and their economic activities. Among Edison's chief innovations were things like the phonograph, which brought music and recordings into Americans' living rooms, the light bulb, the first motion pictures on a big screen, and the development of a system for generating and distributing electric power. The spread of electricity, in particular, proved essential to industry and the growth of cities, since it provided a much more reliable and flexible source of power than either water or steam, the things that powered the very first industrial revolution in America in the early 19th century. If the economic growth of the Gilded Age was dramatic, it was also highly volatile. Between 1897 and 1904 alone, some 4,000 firms fell by the wayside or were gobbled up by others, and a wave of business mergers resulted in the establishment of giant corporations and the rise of figures recognized as the tycoons of American business. People like J.P. Morgan, who we see in this image here. J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, captured in this picture, formed what was known as the U.S. Steel Corporation. And then there was the Standard Oil Company, owned by John D. Rockefeller, who we see here. Both of these corporations, U.S. Steel and Standard Oil, came to dominate major parts of the national economy in the early 20th century. Carnegie wanted to create a steel company that controlled every aspect of the business, from raw materials to transportation, manufacturing, and distribution. By the 1890s, he controlled nearly the entire steel industry and amassed a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars. In today's money, many hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time that he accumulated an enormous personal fortune, Carnegie also, at the same time, believed that the rich had an obligation to promote what he called advancement of society. And to this end, he established a number of philanthropic endeavors, becoming best known for the creation of public libraries in towns and cities throughout the country. But when it came to running his steel company, on the other hand, Carnegie was dictatorial and tyrannical. He demanded that his factories operate non-stop, functioning according to 2 12-hour shifts every day of the year, only excepting the 4th of July. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller created a monopoly. He controlled the drilling, refining, storage, and distribution of oil. As early as the 1880s, his Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of the entire industry. Also, like Carnegie, Rockefeller gave much of his personal fortune away to philanthropic endeavors, such as the establishment of educational and medical research foundations. And finally, just like Carnegie, he bitterly fought against his employees' efforts to organize themselves into unions of workers. Depending on one's perspective, figures like Morgan, Carnegie, and Rockefeller were either captains of industry whose energy and vision pushed the economy forward, or they were robber barons, dangerous individuals who exercised power without any accountability in an unregulated marketplace. As we've already noted, the country's economic growth in the Gilded Age distributed its benefits very unevenly. The vast majority of American laborers experienced economic insecurity as a completely basic, ordinary, and perpetual fact of life. Just a few examples can paint the picture. During the economic depression of the 1870s, and again in the 1890s, millions of workers lost their jobs or faced reductions in pay. Between 1880 and 1900, an average of 35,000 workers perished each year in factory and mine accidents. That was the highest rate in the industrial world at the time. Most working-class families in the Gilded Age were so desperately poor that their survival depended upon the production of income from all family members, including children. By 1890, the richest 1% of Americans received the same total income as the entire bottom half of the population and owned more property than the remaining 99%. Many of the wealthiest Americans of the period consciously pursued an aristocratic lifestyle, building palatial homes, attending exclusive social clubs, schools and colleges, holding fancy dress balls, and marrying into each other's families. Take the example of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who we see in the image here. Vanderbilt, or Commodore, as he preferred to be called, made his fortune in railroads. His estate in Newport, Rhode Island, a museum today, can offer us some idea of the enormous wealth and extravagance that characterized the lives of the captains of industry, or robber barons, of the Gilded Age. The view from outside alone is stunning, as we can see in this photo. But from the inside, many of these homes are truly breathtaking. This is the living room at Vanderbilt's mansion, known as the Breakers. It's like a miniature Palace of Versailles. And the dining room. The bedroom. And finally, but certainly not least, the library. There were two popular novels of the period that captured the stark contrast between extravagant wealth and extreme poverty in the Gilded Age. In The Theory of the Leisure Class, published in 1899, Thorstein Veblen, who we see in this image, offered a harsh critique of an upper-class culture obsessed with what he called conspicuous consumption. The phrase was meant to describe individuals, families, or even groups who spent money not on needed or even desired things, but rather made a display of their wealth simply for the sake of ego fulfillment. Flaunting the things they possessed publicly was a way of saying, literally through the items that they owned, just look, everybody, at how much money I or my family has. Look at me. Look at me. What Veblen described with the phrase conspicuous consumption should ring quite loud in our contemporary ears today, since he described a world that we are, literally, in the moment, still occupying. Jacob Riis, who we can see here, in 1890 published a work entitled How the Other Half Lives. It became famous not so much for what Riis wrote, but for the real-life photographs of living conditions among America's urban poor that he filled the book with. From dark, airless tenement houses to the people who somehow existed inside of them, Riis depicted the desperation of human beings with images that spoke far louder than any words could. Here are just a few that give us a good idea of why the work was so compelling. A poor family inside a Manhattan tenement house. And the view from the outside. Homeless orphans on New York City streets, alone. And banding together for warmth and comfort. Both Veblen and Riis's works question the morality of America in the Gilded Age. How could a so-called free country allow the majority of its citizens to live in such conditions? Outside of the nation's cities, there was no place where capitalism penetrated more rapidly or more thoroughly than in the American West. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, the frontier of continuous white settlement did not extend very far beyond the Mississippi River, while to the west of it lay millions of acres of fertile and mineral-rich land roamed by giant herds of buffalo, whose meat and hides provided food, clothing, and shelter for a population of more than 250,000 Native Americans. Ever since the beginning of colonial British settlement in North America, the West was seen as a place of opportunity for those seeking to improve their condition in life. Yet at the same time, the West was anything but a paradise for small farmers. In California, Indians were forced to labor on missions run by members of religious orders like the Spanish Franciscans. Landlords, railroads, and mining companies in the West by the 19th century were already using large numbers of Mexican migrant and indentured laborers, some of whom we can see in this image here. along with Chinese who worked on long-term contracts building railroads and working in mines, and up until the end of the Civil War, African American slaves. The federal government acquired Indian lands through both wars and treaties, and it administered land sales and loaned money to farmers, railroad companies, and mining corporations. Even as intermittent Indian wars raged through the final decades of the 19th century, settlers continued to pour into the West. Territorial and state governments eager for population, along with railroad companies eager to sell the immense tracts of land they'd acquired from the federal government, flooded European countries and eastern cities in the U.S. with promotional literature, promising easy access to land. To provide just some perspective on how quickly the West was being transformed, consider the fact that more land came into cultivation in the 30 years after the Civil War than in the previous 2.5 centuries of American history. The farmers who settled the West at the end of the 19th century made up a diverse group of native-born whites from the eastern states, blacks escaping the collapse of Reconstruction in the South, along with immigrants from places like Canada, Germany, Scandinavia, and Great Britain. Increasingly, the small farmers who predominated in the West became oriented to national and international markets, specializing in the production of single crops for sale in faraway places. At the same time, railroads began delivering factory-made goods to rural areas and people, replacing more and more items that rural folk used to make for themselves at home, with the result that farm families became ever more dependent on loans to purchase things like land, machinery, and industrial products. They became more and more vulnerable, in other words, to the ups and downs of prices for agricultural goods on the world market. Over time, the future of Western farming would reside not with them, but with giant agricultural enterprises that relied on irrigation, chemicals, and heavy machinery, investments that were far beyond the means of farm families. In California, for example, the state's vast fruit and vegetable farms were taken over by corporations like the Southern Pacific Railroad, and the fields came to be tilled not by laborers who could expect to own land of their own one day, but rather by migrant laborers from China, the Philippines, Japan, and Mexico. The American West was also much more than a farming empire at the end of the 19th century. Western mining, from Michigan, iron ore and copper, to gold and silver in California, Nevada, and Colorado, came under the control of companies that mobilized Eastern and European investment to introduce advanced technology. Here's an image of a Colorado mining town from the period. Gold and silver rushes took place in the Dakotas in 1876, in Idaho in 1883, and even in Alaska in the 1890s. Of course, the incorporation of the West into the national economy spelled the final doom of the Plains Indians and their world. Beginning almost immediately after the close of the Civil War, in the late 1860s, a host of Union Army generals set out to destroy the foundations of Indian lives, sacking and burning villages, stealing horses, and especially slaughtering the buffalo to the brink of extinction. In 1800, the buffalo population on the Great Plains stood at around 30 million, but army campaigns, along with the depredations of hunters seeking hides, rendered the vast herds almost out of existence by the end of the 19th century. Relentless attacks from the United States Army broke the power of one tribe after another. In 1877, the Nez Perce Indians, led by Chief Joseph, who we can see in this image, led federal troops on a 1,700-mile trek across the West before being forced to surrender and relocate to what was called Indian Territory in today's Oklahoma. Every once in a while, Indians were able to inflict costly delays and even defeat upon American forces, as in the case of the Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876, captured here in Edgar Samuel Paxson's famous painting from the time. It was here in southeastern Montana, Big Sky country, that General George Armstrong Custer and his entire command of 250 soldiers were killed by Sioux and Cheyenne warriors under the leadership of the chieftains Sitting Bull, who we see here, and Crazy Horse, captured in this picture. The problem for Indians was that events like Little Bighorn only temporarily delayed the onward rush of white troops, settlers, and prospectors. Between 1865 and 1890, 8 new western states entered the Union, including Nebraska, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. Railroads came to crisscross the Great Plains, and farmers and cattlemen moved in to exploit the lands formerly owned by Indians. The Plains tribes were removed, one after another, and placed on reservations, where they endured lives of poverty and were frequently preyed upon by unscrupulous traders and government agents. Drug and especially alcohol abuse grew exponentially within Indian reservation communities in the late 19th century. In 1871, Congress eliminated the treaty system, which dated all the way back to the time of the American Revolution. This was the mechanism used by the federal government to negotiate agreements with Indians, who were considered to be members of independent nations. The elimination of the treaty system was followed in 1887 with what came to be known as the Dawes Act, for which we have an image here. This law, the Dawes Act, broke up the land of nearly all tribes into small parcels. These small plots of acreage would be redistributed to Indian families, with the remainder, meaning a majority of the land, to be auctioned off to white purchasers and speculating interests. Indians who accepted their small farms and acquired the so-called habits of civilized life were promised acceptance as full-fledged American citizens. But of course, as we know, this was a promise that the government never intended to keep. The policy, needless to say, proved disastrous to Indians, resulting in the loss of enormous amounts of tribal lands and the erosion of many Indian cultural traditions. In just the half century after the passage of the Dawes Act, Native Americans lost 86 million of the 138 million acres of land they possessed in 1887. Finally, at the end of December, just a few days after Christmas in 1890, came the event that many scholars point to as marking the official end of 4 centuries of military conflict between the true native population of North America and European settlers and their descendants. This was the infamous attack by federal troops against Indians at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, which killed nearly 200 people, most of whom were women and children. Here are a couple of real images from what American newspapers of the time applauded as the massacre at Wounded Knee. While we take in this documentary record of our collective American past, it's worth reflecting also on the fact that the Army conducted an inquiry into the massacre at the time. It completely exonerated the troops involved of any wrongdoing. 20 of the soldiers instead later received medals of honor for the war crimes and atrocities they committed that day. This was Gilded Age America. On the golden surface of society, people saw the whirlwind of motion and activity, new technologies and inventions, new industries and ways of organizing almost every aspect of individuals' lives. It was so head-spinning that few cared to look beneath the surface at the dark underbelly of the beast, and the price being paid by the many for the benefit of the few. Every kind of corruption, especially political and economic, reached entirely new heights in these years. The power of the new corporations like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil, which were seemingly immune to democratic control, raised disturbing questions for the American understanding of political freedom and popular self-government as being synonymous. In the Pennsylvania state legislature, for example, what was known as the Third House of railroad lobbyists exerted as much influence as elected officials did. Out west, many lawmakers came to hold stock or directorships in lumber and railroad companies that received public aid. Politics in America's cities fell under the control of corrupt political machines. The most infamous was New York's Tweed Ring, as it was known, which plundered the city of tens of millions of dollars. Boss William N. Tweed's organization, we see a picture of him here, reached into literally every neighborhood. He won public support by fashioning a kind of private welfare system that provided food, fuel, and jobs in hard times. Even after his fall from power in the early 1870s, the city's poor continued to view him as a sort of urban Robin Hood figure who stole from the rich just to give to the poor. At the national level, the most notorious example of corruption occurred in 1872 during Ulysses S. Grant's second term as president in what came to be known as the Credit Mobilier scandal. We can see a political cartoon about the controversy here. Credit Mobilier was a corporation formed by an inner ring of Union Pacific Railroad stockholders to oversee the line's government-assisted construction. Essentially, it enabled the participants to sign contracts with themselves to build the new line at an exorbitant profit. Those involved subsequently protected the arrangement by distributing stock to influential politicians in Congress. The ultimate exposure of the scheme went a long way toward discrediting the second Grant administration. In the national political elections of the Gilded Age period, the country proved deeply divided, with Republicans controlling the industrial North and the Midwest, proving especially popular among members of revivalist churches, Protestant immigrants, and blacks, while Democrats, after the end of Reconstruction in 1877, controlled the South and did well among Catholic voters, especially Irish Americans in the nation's cities. In 3 out of the 5 presidential elections between 1876 and 1892, the margin separating the major candidates was less than 1% of the popular vote. Only for brief periods did the same party control the White House and both houses of Congress. And Gilded Age presidents made little effort to mobilize public opinion or extend their executive leadership. Not only were elections of the time closely contested, but party loyalty was intense. Voter turnout through these years consistently remained above 80%, a figure unheard of and nearly unimaginable today. Nationally, both political parties in the Gilded Age came under the control of powerful political managers with close ties to business interests. Republicans were known for strongly supporting a high tariff tax to protect American industry, and throughout the 1870s, they pursued a fiscal policy based on reducing federal spending, repaying much of the national debt, and withdrawing greenbacks, paper money, from circulation. Democrats opposed the high tariff, but the party's national leadership still remained closely linked to New York bankers and financiers, and they resisted demands from debt-ridden agricultural areas for an increase in the money supply. In 1879, for the first time since the Civil War, Congress returned the United States to the gold standard. That is, paper currency became exchangeable for gold at a fixed rate. This policy not only favored the interests of northern bankers and industrialists, it worked to the specific disadvantage of southern and western farmers, who had to pay a premium for manufactured goods, while watching the prices for their own agricultural goods continue to decline seemingly with every passing year. In 1887, in response to public outcries against railroad practices, Congress established the ICC, or Interstate Commerce Commission. The goal was to ensure that the rates railroads charged farmers and merchants to transport their goods were, quote, reasonable, and did not offer more favorable treatment to some shippers over others, meaning, corporate clients over small individual farmers. Here's a political cartoon of the time that focused on the ICC's obvious deficiencies. The ICC was the very first federal agency intended to regulate economic activity, but because it lacked the power to fix rates on its own, all that the ICC could do was sue companies in court, with the result that little changed in terms of railroad practices. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned all combinations, meaning monopolies, and practices that restrained free trade. But again, the language of the measure proved so vague that the law became all but impossible to enforce. Still, both the ICC and Sherman Antitrust Act helped to establish the precedent that the national government could regulate the economy to promote the public good. It was also in the Gilded Age years that the American labor movement began to revitalize itself, calling for laws to establish things like an 8-hour workday. Much like farmers in the South and West, workers in northern and midwestern cities started to inspire a truly national debate on the definition of political and economic freedom in a capitalist society. Not just industrialists, the Carnegies and Rockefellers of the era, but cultural elites from a variety of backgrounds recoiled at this renewed assertiveness on the part of working class people. The idea of the natural superiority of some groups to others, which before the Civil War had been invoked to justify slavery in an otherwise free society, now reemerged during the Gilded Age in the vocabulary of modern science to explain the success not just of individuals, but entire social classes. In a highly oversimplified form of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, academics and journalists coined phrases like natural selection and the survival of the fittest to describe what came to be known as social Darwinism. The idea is captured in this political cartoon of the time. Social Darwinism argued that evolution was as natural a process in human society as in the natural world. And because of this, governments should not interfere, especially not in an effort to uplift those at the bottom of the social order. Such theorists insisted that passing laws to aid the poor, for example, would only succeed in reducing society as a whole to a much more primitive level. Even the economic depressions of the 1870s and 1890s failed to shake the widespread view that the poor were essentially responsible for their own fate. Failure to advance in society was widely thought to indicate a lack of character, an absence of self-reliance and determination in the face of adversity. The growing influence of social Darwinism helped to popularize an idea that was embraced by the business and professional classes of the Gilded Age. This was an essentially negative definition of freedom, characterized as limited government combined with an unrestrained and unregulated free market. The principle of free labor which had originated as a celebration of the independent small producer in a society of broad equality and social harmony, was transformed into a defense of the unmitigated operations of the capitalist marketplace. Public debate in the United States during the Gilded Age years came to divide along class lines. Nowhere was this more clear than in the country's first ever experience with a national labor walkout, what came to be known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. When workers protesting a pay cut paralyzed rail traffic in much of the country, state militia units tried to force them back to work, but failed. After troops fired on striking workers in Pittsburgh, killing 20, many laborers responded by burning the city's railroad yards, as we can see in this sketch here, along with a couple of real photographs from the time. Millions of dollars in property was destroyed. The president, Rutherford B. Hayes, called up federal troops to restore order in the city, to break up the strike and force workers back to their jobs. In the ensuing years, the federal government began to construct armories next to rail yards as a means of guaranteeing the rights, not of workers, but the property rights of their bosses. The 1880s witnessed a new wave of labor organizing, and at its center stood a group known as the Knights of Labor, led by Terence V. Powderly, who we see in this sketch. The Knights were the first group to organize unskilled as well as skilled workers. Here's an image of their declaration of principles. The Knights organized women as well as men, and blacks as well as whites. For a while, they represented a real challenge to the power of the robber barons in the Gilded Age. Here's a political cartoon of the time showing Powderly preparing to run his cane up the backside of the railroad magnate Jay Gould. The Knights reached a peak membership of around 800,000 members in 1886, involving millions of workers in strikes, boycotts, and political action, and they provided educational and social activities for workers. Labor reformers of the Gilded Age, like the Knights of Labor, put forward a wide array of programs, from the 8-hour workday to public employment and hard times and currency reform. Some even promoted anarchism and socialism as remedies to the abuses of capitalism, calling for what they described as a cooperative commonwealth. Labor toward the end of the 19th century raised the truly poignant question of whether meaningful freedom could even exist in a situation of extreme economic inequality. Dissatisfaction with social and economic conditions in the Gilded Age was not limited to aggrieved workers. Social thinkers of the time, alarmed by fears of class warfare and the growing power of concentrated capital, offered numerous plans for change. In the last quarter of the 19th century, more than 150 utopian or cataclysmic novels appeared, predicting that social conflict would end either in a new, harmonious social order or in total catastrophe. Of the many books proposing more optimistic remedies for the unequal distribution of wealth, the most popular were Progress and Poverty by Henry George in 1879, The Cooperative Commonwealth by Lawrence Gronlund in 1884, and Edward Bellamy's 1888 work, Looking Backward. All three writers, though in very different ways, sought to reclaim an imagined golden age of social harmony and American freedom. Henry George, who we see in this image, wrote about the growth of squalor and misery alongside material progress. His solution was what he called the single tax, which would replace other taxes with a levy on increases in the value of real estate. Lawrence Gronlund, who we see in this sketch, was a socialist who believed that private control of economic enterprises should be replaced by government ownership to ensure a fairer distribution of wealth. Whereas Karl Marx, the 19th century's most influential social theorist, predicted that socialism would come into being through a working-class revolution, Gronlund instead portrayed it as the end result of a process of peaceful evolution, not violent upheaval. He made socialism seem more acceptable to middle-class Americans who desired an end to class conflict and the restoration of social harmony in the country. Edward Bellamy, captured in this photograph, in his own work, Looking Backward, promoted socialist ideas, but he did not use the term in his writing. Bellamy described what he called nationalism. In the novel, his main character, like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, falls asleep in the late 19th century, only to awaken in the year 2000 to a world where cooperation has replaced class strife, excessive individualism, and cutthroat competition. Freedom, Bellamy insisted, was a social condition that rested on people's interdependence, their ability to rely upon one another, not on the autonomy of individuals. His book inspired the creation of hundreds of what were called nationalist clubs all across the country that devoted themselves to bringing into existence Bellamy's world of 2000. Looking Backward left a profound mark on an entire generation of reformers and intellectuals. Bellamy held out the hope of retaining the material abundance made possible by industrial capitalism, while at the same time eliminating inequality. Not just social thinkers like George, Gronlund, and Bellamy, but mainstream Protestant religious leaders as well tried their hand at suggesting reforms in the Gilded Age years. Their mission was to stamp out what they viewed as sinful behavior in society. What became known as a Christian lobby promoted political solutions to the moral problems raised by things like labor conflict and the growth of cities, as well as perceived threats to religious faith posed by Darwinism and other scientific advances. Unlike the pre-Civil War period, however, when moral suasion was the preferred approach of reformers, powerful national organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the National Reform Association actively campaigned for federal laws that would, as it were, Christianize the government by outlawing sinful behavior. Among the proposed targets were things like the consumption of alcohol, gambling, prostitution, polygamy, and birth control. In a glaring departure from the pre-Civil War situation, Southerners joined in this campaign for federal regulation of individual behavior, something whites in the region had always strongly opposed prior to the war because they feared it would lead to action against slavery. The key role played by the white South in the campaign for moral legislation helped earn the region a reputation as the Bible Belt, a place where political action revolves around perceived religious principles. Even though efforts to enact a national law requiring businesses to close on Sundays failed, the Christian lobby's efforts set the stage for later campaigns that were successful, such as Prohibition in the early 20th century. While most of the era's Protestant preachers concentrated on attacking individual sins like drinking and Sabbath breaking, and saying nothing about the cost to society of the indiscriminate pursuit of wealth and property, a relatively small group of ministers in the Northeast and Midwest primarily started to outline what would become known as the social gospel. In the writings of Walter Rauschenbusch, a Baptist minister from New York City, who we have in this image here, and Washington Gladden, a congregational clergyman from Columbus, Ohio, captured in this photograph. The idea was put forth that freedom and spiritual self-development required what adherents to this social gospel called an equalization of wealth and power. Rauschenbusch and Gladden insisted that unbridled competition mocked the ideal of Christian brotherhood. This social gospel movement originated as an effort to reform Protestant churches by expanding their appeal in poor urban neighborhoods and making them more attentive to the era's social problems. The movement's adherents established missions and relief programs in northern and midwestern cities. They tried to alleviate poverty, fought against things like child labor, while encouraging actions such as the construction of better working class housing. The year 1886, as it turned out, was an important one in the history of the Gilded Age. It marked an event that many scholars point to as perhaps the ultimate symbol of the period. 1886 was the year that the Statue of Liberty was dedicated. But that's not the event we're talking about. On May 1st, some 350,000 workers in cities across the country demonstrated for an 8-hour workday. Having originated in the United States, May 1st, or May Day as it would come to be known, soon turned into an annual date of parades, picnics, and protests celebrated around the world by organized labor. The drama of 1886 centered not so much on the harbor in New York City, but on Chicago, a city with a large and vibrant labor movement that brought together native-born and immigrant workers. Workers whose outlooks ranged from immigrant socialism and anarchism to American traditions of anti-monopoly and equality. On May 3rd, 4 strikers were killed by Chicago police. The next day, a rally was held in Haymarket Square, which we can see in this photograph from the time. The rally in Haymarket Square the next day was held to protest the killings of these workers and strikers by Chicago policemen. Near the end of the protest speeches, someone whose identity has never been determined threw a bomb into the crowd, killing a policeman. Here we have a few sketches of the event from artists' interpretations. In the immediate wake of the explosion, panicked police on the scene opened fire, shooting several bystanders and a number of their own comrades. Soon after, authorities raided the offices of labor and radical groups all across the city, arresting their leaders. Employers took the opportunity of the Haymarket affair to paint the entire labor movement as a dangerous and un-American force, prone to violence and controlled by foreign-born radicals. 8 anarchists were charged with plotting and carrying out the bombing, despite the fact that the evidence against them was extremely weak. A jury convicted the Haymarket martyrs, as they came to be known, with 4 being hanged, 1 committing suicide while in prison, and the remaining 3 incarcerated until John Peter Altgeld, a pro-labor governor of Illinois, commuted their sentences in 1893. Here we have an image of the 5 men who lost their lives. Overall, the events of 1886 suggested that labor might be on the verge of establishing itself as a permanent political force. But in fact, that year marked the high water moment for groups like the Knights of Labor. Facing increasing employer and government hostility and linked by the press of the time to the violence and radicalism associated with the Haymarket bombing, the Knights and other groups just like them soon declined. But their legacy remained. One last photograph here makes the point. This is a May Day parade from 1900 honoring the events in Chicago of 1886, held not in the United States, but in Melbourne, Australia. All right, so that completes our look at the Gilded Age. Next time we'll finish off the 19th century with the discussion of what we call the populist era in American history.